Hello Dragons, I'm Lisa, founder of Snope, a revolutionary, patented solid soap and solid shampoo dispenser.
I'm Anthony, Lisa's husband and business partner, and we're here today seeking a £50,000 investment for a 5% stake in Snope.
The idea for Snope came to me when I realised solid bars of soap were proving impractical for our busy family. Nobody wanted to share the bar. The bar always ended up a slimy lump with a hair on it on the sink. But before I reverted to liquids, I wanted to understand what that meant.
And the issue with liquids is gigantic, with UK homes alone discarding 1.8 billion hand wash, body wash and shampoo bottles every single year. And on top of that, liquids have 10 times the carbon footprint of solids. That's a big problem. So Lisa wanted to see what was out there. Was there a hybrid, something with the convenience of the dispenser, but all of the environmental benefits of solid bars?
When I couldn't find anything, I invented the solution and Snope was born. It takes 2 solid bars of soap or shampoo and dispenses a fine snow-like powder. Snope is eco-friendly, cost-saving. 2 bars of soap give 2,000 hand washes, and that's equivalent to 20 bottles of 250ml hand wash, body wash or shampoo. We launched 18 months ago and we're in over 200 happy Snopey households and in over 30 businesses, including schools, cinemas, and we've just signed a hotel, which is part of a large global hotel chain, which is game-changing for Snope.
So you're saying that you're going to revolutionise the hand soap market.
Correct.
And the power that you've got in that container is your product.
The container is the product and
not all those
the
soaps
refillables.
you've got up there.
Yes, all of that is our product. We've got accessories, we've got soap bars and shampoo bars as well.
It's not a powder, it's a bar, and she grates
Oh, I see, it's a bar and you're squeezing it.
Yes.
Correct, grating it, grating it. Yeah, 2
Right, I
bars
see.
inside.
How many bars have you got in there?
2.
Gotcha.
Great benefits that our commercial premises love is for the operatives, it's so much easier because you're not lumping around a 5-litre jack of liquid that you've got to pour into here. You've got a 110-gram bar that's equivalent to 2.5 litres in itself.
Can you explain to me what stage you're at with the patent?
Yeah, so we've got patents fully granted here in the UK.
Oh, wow.
And we've got EU and US pending. And that's for the dispenser itself. And then we've got patents on the soap.
Yeah.
How do you get a patent on the soap?
Because we've got the shape, the hole, because it needs a hole because it rotates around a central point, and the etching marks on the top because they have a functional benefit to them. You got to make a big redesign to do anything around it. I got to say, our patent attorney, we focused on that because we knew how important it was to protect, and he's outstanding.
It is, at the moment, it's quite a chunky looking thing. How much flexibility have you got in terms of design? So if you think at the moment, your big market here is going to be hotels.
Yeah.
And at the moment, they do some fantastic deals with brands.
Yeah.
And your market is going to be multifold. It's going to be you supplying the product. But if you do have this wonderful device, then licensing that to other brands that can put their brand across, you know, is going to be as important. But they're going to want flexibility of brand.
Yeah.
So they're going to want to say, actually, I'd like it that colour, and I'd like it a bit longer, and I'd like one soap to go, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, so from a patent point of view, there's no problem with that.
Yeah,
we can certainly change that. It's just the tooling. We're totally open to changing the design and the look of it.
Because I'm really, really quick, and I don't need to ask many questions like some of the other dragons, I'm just going to get straight to the point and make you an offer. Because I literally, when I saw it, when you demonstrated it, I just got it. So you've asked for £50,000 for 5%. I'm going to offer you all of the money for 10% of the business.
Thank you, Peter.
Lisa, Anthony, if you do a phenomenal job of presenting this as the antithesis to a current way of working that is unenvironmentally friendly, that is inefficient, then you could start to really eat up that market if you nail the storytelling online, which happens to be my bread and butter. It is what I do. So I'd love to throw my weight behind making sure that this reaches its potential. So I'm going to make you an offer, which is I'm going to offer you all of the money for 10% of the business as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I love it.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
I don't know if you know, but I've actually just been part of a campaign saying stop using liquid soap. You know, it's because this is just so much a better solution. So I, of course, am going to make you an offer.
Thank you.
I'm not going to make it easy for you because I'm going to duplicate theirs. So I'm going to offer you all of the money for 10% of the business.
Thank you.
I absolutely love the business. I love the product. I would love to work with you both, and I'd love to be involved in this. So I'm also going to offer you all of the money for 10% of the business.
Thank you.
You've created something which is revolutionary.
Thank you.
And I would definitely love to come on this journey with you. So I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to offer you all of the money.
Be kind, Tuka.
No, but you got 10%, and I'm not going to go over 10%. And I'm wondering, do I undercut them or not?
I think you should.
It's the only chance you got to get it.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll offer you all the money for 8%.
Thank you, Dragons. We really appreciate the offers. That's really exciting. And we're delighted with the offers, absolutely delighted. I think the thing for us is we would love to have multiple Dragons. We felt that we valued the business very fairly coming in at 5% for £50,000. So we just want to understand whether there's any wiggle room in that or what the wiggle room is.
I would be prepared to reduce my offer to 7.5%. And I would also be prepared to share with one other dragon. I don't think you need I actually don't think you need multiple dragons. And if you were trying to split it in lots of ways, I think it's not really something that I would want to get involved with. I just think you dilute to the point where we all kind of think, well, you know, we'll give them the attention when they want it. Yeah,
Appreciate
No
that.
problem.
I'm tempted. It's the link with what Deborah and I have got with Fussy. It's obvious here. So I'm kind of tempted to say that if I match Deborah's 7.5 and join forces, you've got Deborah and I think you've got the dream ticket. Was that your thinking, Deborah?
Well, it does. It makes perfect sense.
Okay, so Anthony and Lisa, I will match Deborah's offer. So going down to that 7.5 on a split basis with her.
Okay.
I would be willing to do 50,000 for 7.5% as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To be totally transparent, I also think your valuation on the business was fair. Your patents, I think, are very, very valuable. So I would be happy to take part of the business at the 5% stake.
Brilliant. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sarah. Thank you.
Well, it leaves me.
Sorry,
Yes.
yes, Duca, sorry.
So I will revise my offer.
Yeah.
I will give you the whole 50,000 for 5%.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
We go and chat at the back.
Yep, we can do the chat with the wall.
Game face.
Right.
Right, thank you. Guys, we're massively conflicted. So we're really sad to lose some of you because you've obviously said really want it to be a couple. So Peter and Deborah, we're going to accept your offer, please.
Oh,
Hey.
Sarah.
Thank you.
Sorry, Sarah.
Good.
Sorry, Tuka.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen.
Good.
Thank
It
goodness.
happens.
Well
Don't
done.
worry about it.
Yeah, we know you guys.
Well done, you. I love it.
Brilliant.
Looking
Thank
forward
you.
to it.